Whether you consider yourself a meticulous plotter or a pantser who comes up with scenes as they go, figuring out how your plot is going to unravel can be a real challenge. After all, you want to make sure that all the puzzle pieces of your story are fitting together perfectly to give the reader the experience that you intend. And frankly, it can take a lot of experimenting and a lot of drafts to get your plot just right and make sure you nail it. So in this video, I am going to provide a framework for how to think about your plot and evaluate if it is effective or if it could potentially use some work. I'm going to walk you through a series of questions to ask yourself about your story, and the answers can help you determine if your plot is holding up and delivering the story as you intend it to, or if there are some areas or elements that potentially need to be tweaked or amplified in your story so that the plot is super solid. A little cheat sheet is that if you answer no to any of the questions I am going to walk through, then that could be a sign that your plot could be improved. If you are somewhere along the book drafting process and you have a novel in progress, I recommend subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. Every week, I post a new video either with tactical writing tips like this one, or I talk about the book publishing industry, especially the traditional publishing process, because my background is in Big Five publishing and working at a literary agency. So I'd love to have you around and join this amazing community for all of that. I also have a freebie in the description below that could be really helpful for you, especially if you are concerned about your plot. It is called my Story Self-Assessment resource, and similar to this video, it is going to help you take a critical eye to your manuscript and identify potential weaknesses in it so that you can step back into it and strengthen it for the next draft. That is also going to sign you up for my exclusive newsletter where I provide tips and insights you won't find anywhere on my channel. So don't miss out on that. Now let's dive into the first question I want you to ask yourself about your plot, and that is there a clear point of conflict? Your plot needs to center around a clear and identifiable point of conflict that the reader ultimately wants to see play out, because that is going to be what compels them to continue reading. For example, in a will they, won't they romance narrative, the point of conflict is around whether or not those two characters are going to end up in a romantic relationship or not. And the reader is invested in seeing how that conflict plays out and if it resolves in the two getting together or if they break up. So I challenge you to do an exercise to identify your story's main point of conflict. Fill in the blanks in this sentence. Protagonist wants X, but Y is stopping them. Let's go through an example of how this might be filled out using one of my favorite movies, The Lion King. In this example, Simba wants to take back Pride Rock, but Scar is stopping him. So write this sentence out for your own novel and see what you come up with. That is going to illuminate for you what the main plot content should be centering around. And ideally, you're going to introduce this point of conflict within the first 10 pages and no later than the first chapter of your novel. This is especially important if you are planning to traditionally publish your book and query literary agents, because it's those first pages that ultimately determine whether an agent is going to be interested in reading more of the manuscript or not. But I would argue that establishing this main point of conflict as early as possible is just as important in self-publishing, because that's still when you are trying to hook your reader into your story. Now, you might come back and say, well, I have multiple points of conflict. It's not just one thing. In this case, I would challenge you to see what is the overarching point of conflict? What is the overarching objective that the protagonist is trying to achieve, and what is stopping them? Even if there are multiple things the protagonist is struggling with, they should all relate back to a bigger picture item. And if they don't, then that could signal that you need to rework your plot to be focused on a main point of conflict. The next question I want you to ask yourself about your plot is, are the stakes high enough? Once you have established your story's main point of conflict, the next and equally crucial step is making sure the stakes feel high. Because if the conflict isn't going to meaningfully impact the characters one way or another, then it is unlikely that the reader is going to get invested in seeing how the conflict and story plays out. The reader needs to feel as though there are going to be significant consequences for the main characters if they don't achieve their goal, because that is going to be what makes them feel invested in continuing to read. So what are those consequences in the case of your story? Let's add on to our exercise from the previous point where we found that main conflict. So to determine the stakes, fill in the line, protagonist wants X, but Y is stopping them. If they fail, Z will happen. So to play out the Lion King example again, Simba wants to take back Pride Rock, but Scar is stopping him. If he fails, Scar will take over the kingdom forever. Do you see how that establishes the stakes of the story? We immediately feel that the stakes of this conflict are high, because the kingdom getting taken over would obviously have severe ramifications for all of the characters. Now let's talk through the third question to ask about your plot. Do the characters confront obstacles? Your plot is made up of a series of situations that you put your protagonist in. And along their journey, they should confront several obstacles that hinder and threaten their success. These obstacles are what make up that why portion of the line that we have been drafting about our plot. They are what keeps the protagonist from quickly achieving their goal. And therefore, it is these obstacles that are contributing to the continued sense of conflict. If the story is all smooth sailing, it is unlikely your reader is going to be interested in it. And then seeing the protagonist achieve their goal is ultimately not even going to feel satisfying. So you want to make sure that you make all your characters work for their goals by putting them through trials and tribulations. Again, to go through the Lion King example, some obstacles that Simba faces on his journey are the hyenas and his own self-doubt that he will be a good king. That is a good example because remember that obstacles don't always have to be external or physical. They can also be internal and emotional. The next question to ask yourself about your plot to determine its effectiveness is, do you avoid unnecessary subplots? Once you have established your plot's primary point of conflict, the stakes, and the obstacles that your protagonist is going to face along their journey, you need to ensure that your plot stays tightly focused on that. Otherwise, if you veer off into some other topic or some other subplot, you are likely going to lose your reader and you're going to lose the sense of momentum and urgency. A big pitfall I see a lot of writers fall into is crafting ultimately unnecessary subplots that feel tangential and distract from the main point of conflict. Ultimately, we're just not that invested in these subplots, so you don't want to take the reader away from the meat of the story. An example could be an unnecessary romantic subplot that really doesn't add up to the overarching plot line, or it could be a secondary character's backstory that again doesn't add up to the plot that we are invested in. So think about the Lion King example again. In the first Lion King movie, we don't focus too much on Timon and Pumbaa. They are secondary characters and certainly present, but their individual characters get their whole other follow-up movie. Disney saved all that material for a whole other movie because trying to fit it all into the first movie would have distracted us from Simba's journey. So apply this to your own story and don't try to overcomplicate or overshadow the main plot. Streamline it whenever possible and make sure that everything is serving that main point of conflict. That's not to say that your plot should be simple, but it should be focused, which are very different things. The last question to determine your plot's effectiveness is, do the scenes build on one another? As I just mentioned, we should never lose sight of that main plot conflict, and each scene should deepen that conflict or propel the protagonist's journey further. As the scenes progress, the narrative should have that sense of continuity and constantly be building up to the climax where we ultimately see the protagonist either succeed or fail. So that means you want the reader to be continually aware of and oriented to the status of the protagonist's journey and what obstacles they are facing in achieving their goal. So for instance, if you establish an obstacle in, say, chapter 3 of your novel, but then you don't talk about it again until chapter 10, that doesn't give you a good sense of continuity. Once you have introduced that obstacle, we're going to want to see the protagonist reflect on it and eventually face that obstacle and be constantly aware of it. You don't want to just drop that thread. This might sound like common sense, but you'd be surprised how many times you actually end up dropping a plot thread because you end up focusing on something else in your plot. So sometimes that sense of urgency can actually get lost. And in the worst case, these can become plot holes if you abandon them entirely. So ensuring that each and every scene builds up to that overarching point of conflict, addresses the protagonist's obstacles, and furthers their journey will create that propulsive quality that makes the reader eager to tear through the pages all the way to the end. I hope this video helped you determine if your plot is effective or if it could potentially use some work in certain areas. Remember that it can be immensely helpful to work with either a trusted beta reader or even a professional editor to get fresh eyes on your manuscript, especially if you are in the position of being too close and too deep into it to really sort out the forest from the trees. That story self-assessment that I mentioned in the description below is also going to help you point out those gaps and areas for improvement in your manuscript. Let me know in the comments if you've faced any specific issues with plotting your story. I'd love to hear them and provide any insights I can. And if you're looking for some more tips on plotting, I have a whole other video on cliches to avoid in your plot, so definitely check that out as well. If you found this video helpful, it would mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.